let's talk about the Renaissance. Again, we're moving back to Europe. We started in Europe a couple weeks ago. We finished up with the bubonic plague. We had the Black Death. We had a period known as the Dark Ages. And now we are going into the Renaissance. Well, actually, we moved over to the Americas. We did the Inca, the Aztecs, and the Mayans. And now we're going to move back to Europe and talk about the Renaissance. And that's one of the things that I've learned already from this chapter is how to spell Renaissance. I thought there were two N's at the beginning, but there's not. There's only two N's in the whole thing. So. There are some factors that contributed to the beginning of the Renaissance period. It was an age of recovery from disasters of the 14th century. Those disasters would be the Black Death. You guys remember that? What caused it?
Fleas and rats.
Fleas and rats.
Yes.
And the disease spread. Nobody knew that good sanitation would prevent that, so it kept growing out of control. Now they still were having the Black Plague. It continued the cycle around through Europe. It just wasn't as rampant as it was in the 14th century and the 12th century. Recovery went hand in hand with the rebirth of interest in ancient cultures, meaning ancient Greece and Rome, people started to learn again. Right? During the Dark Ages, that's one of the reasons they call it the Dark Ages, is because people stopped learning. They forgot about the past, and they had some really dark times that they had to get through. All right? A new view of human beings emerged as people in the Italian Renaissance began emphasizing individual abilities. Okay? You had a merchant class that's going to rise almost to the status of nobility. They're going to become very, very, very wealthy. And the reason that things happen in Italy is because, unlike the rest of Europe that went through feudalism, where you had a king, you had serfs, you had nobles that served the king, in Italy, rather than having a whole country, you had individual pockets of city-states that became very powerful. Some other factors that contributed to the beginning of the Renaissance, trade and commerce increased. Again, there were a lot of merchants that became extremely wealthy. Cities grew larger and wealthier, and the newly wealthy merchants and bankers supported the growth of arts and learning. So you kind of have this whole brand new rebirth, and that is literally what Renaissance means. It means rebirth, okay? Suddenly, the old culture, people start learning about it again. They start taking note of what Rome was about, what Greece was about. The Italians in particular start supporting the arts. They have wealthy merchants that start paying for artists, because back then you couldn't just be an artist. You had to have somebody pay your way. You had to have somebody to support your household. And why in Italy? The revival of commerce and town building was more intense in Italy. Again, it was city-states. It wasn't one big country controlled by one king. And each city-state was very powerful. They were doing a lot of commerce between each other. The Christians went and attacked the Islams in Jerusalem and other places throughout the Middle East. The Crusades actually garnered a lot of trade because people suddenly wanted to trade with the Middle East. So Italy was right in the middle of that for Europe. It was a great jumping off point to go to the Middle East. Feudalism, again, had less grip on Italy. And two competing lords for control of Italy were losing their influence. So the city-states began to grow in influence, and the feudalistic system really was non-existent, so there wasn't one consolidating power. Presence of antiquity was stronger in Italy than elsewhere in Europe, meaning they had the ability to kind of go back and remember the past, whereas in the rest of Europe, things were burned, things were just not as organized. They didn't have the libraries or the historical artifacts. The Renaissance was a cultural movement and a time of renewal. Again, Europe was recovering from the Dark Ages and the bubonic plague. So this rebirth period that's why we call it the Renaissance. So what was the Renaissance? It means rebirth, literally classical knowledge and the birth of the modern world. People started thinking about the world in completely different ways. We're going to study a guy called Machiavelli, and he actually had a really horrific view on what a ruler should be. He was all about power, all about lust, and you should do whatever you can to seize that power and keep it in your grasp. The Renaissance. And where did the Renaissance begin? We're just talking about it. What country are we looking at? Italy. Right. Alright, Italy with the boot coming down. That's the Isle of Sicily. And the Italian cities were urban centers, urban societies. Again, each Italian city had its own influence. Each influence was growing, becoming major trading centers. Secular movement, people actually lost their faith in the church. And you'll find during this time, remember we studied the Pope and how he is kind of the supreme being of the Catholic Church. You're going to find that popes are having children. It's supposed to be, what, chaste, not having children. But popes are having children, illegitimate children. There's a lot of corruption in the Catholic Church. So people kind of started turning away from it. They put the focus on human beings and actual material possessions. Right? And the Renaissance took place between the 14th and the 17th century. So just after the Dark Ages ended, we go into this rebirth we call the Renaissance. And how many ends in Renaissance? One. Two ends, two S's. Renaissance. Right, during the Renaissance, we have a dramatic recovery of European commerce. There are important industries that flourish in northern Italy in particular. Textiles, which would be clothing, is a huge one. Significance of printing. The printing press is developed. And the reason that's significant is before you used to have the monks handwriting all the books. So you had to have a room of monks like this just to make, what, 3, 6, 9, 12 different copies of one book. Wow. Now you could have a guy at a printing press and he could do that same book by himself in a week. And it would take the monks months to do because they're copies. Mining is a new industry, becoming a significant industry. And the 15th century banking empire, especially of the Medici family, and the reason they're going to be important is because they're very wealthy individuals and they start supporting the arts, which means you have this incredible flourish of painting, sculpture, architecture, and it's kind of why we call it the Renaissance, because everything starts to grow again. It's a brand new rebirth of Europe. Profit making became more important than the church doctrine. And to overcome guilt, profit makers began to engage in philanthropy. And remember from our chapters, we talked about the world religions. Buddhism was one that was very philanthropical, where you gave away your wealth and that could actually start buying you. Economic diversification, meaning we're all getting some money. Alright. Cottage industries. Art became the way to advertise economic success. So if you wanted to tell the world that you were a success, you would say, this is my artist working for me, look at all these paintings he's done under my supervision, or under my patronage. Intensified commercial competition created a need to be efficient. So as more and more people got into the field, it became more productive, more profit-worthy to be more efficient with your production method. Right? And really the Renaissance period, it's an elitist historical phenomenon. Alright, this is a period where the very, very wealthy people suddenly become great philanthropers. They start investing in the arts heavily. Northern Italy was urban and commercial, while southern Italy mostly was not. So your comment is going on in northern Italy. Do you guys know where Rome is? Have you seen Rome on the map? You know if it's on the north or the south? And I'll give you a hint, it's actually right in the middle. Okay, so Rome's kind of the boundary. Everything north of Rome is flourishing. It's closer to Europe. It's easier for them to trade. And everything in the south is still primarily agricultural. All right, marriages were frequently arranged to strengthen business ties. This is also a new phenomenon with the Renaissance, where a wealthy merchant would have his daughter go and marry another wealthy merchant's family, kind of linking the two families together. Okay. The father's authority over his family, obviously the father is the one that would kind of put all this together, and we're still very much dominant, especially with the business world. And some wealthy women played an important role in Italian city-states. This is Isabella d'Este of Mantua, and a concentration of wealth among the great families, which we call Popolo Grosso. Well, concentration of wealth. Extreme social stratification, divided into factions around the wealthiest families. So again, it was kind of like the top percent were very elite, and the rest of the people were poor. Poor increasingly attempted to improve their social status, so it was possible to move up in your social status, but not likely. There were some revolts. And we had some incredible art pieces. This is actually the creation of man. This represents God, this represents Adam. The number of portraits painted during this era illustrates the focus on the individual. All right, so kind of a change in thought from the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages was mostly about survival, right? You've got these bands, you've got Attila the Hun coming through. People join feudalistic societies to protect themselves. They stay close to their king, they stay close to a castle. A lot of bandits going on. Now suddenly law and order sort of takes effect again, and the plagues have stopped coming through, at least in great numbers like they were. There still is the plague, but it's not half as bad as it used to be. We start seeing a true noble man. You've always heard of kind of noble. We talked about the nobility with the Aztecs. They're actually increasing in stature now in Italy. Growing humanism and secularism in Christian context, when people are starting to really truly practice Christianity and being a Christian person. All this, however, is going to be heavily, not debunked, but disputed by Machiavelli. He is a really, really hardcore boss of power of person. Focus is going to be on man's free will, and there are rewards for living excellently that came in this life. In politics, there was the same pattern in problems as those of the Greek city-states. Inter-city warfare led to new advances in diplomacy. There was a balance of power. And in northern Italy, you actually had communes of people. Does anyone know what a commune is? Ever heard that term?
A what?
A commune?
A communist?
Commune. Well, communist kind of comes from that, same root. It's like a society of people living together for the good of the society. The Incas were kind of like that, right? They lived together for the good of society. Didn't have a lot of material possessions. They did everything for society as a whole, the culture. The cities that really flourished, Rome, which had been around for centuries, obviously that was the kingdom of the Roman Empire, the capital of the Roman Empire. Venice, Milan, Florence, and the kingdom of Naples. These were all the cities that really gained in stature, really gained in power. There's something called Renaissance Venice and Renaissance Florence. And in the 1300s, republicanism became despotism, with the exception of Venice. And despotism would be where you have one person who's in charge of everything. So republicanism would be where people controlled the government. Despotism would be where one person controls the government. We are starting to get into the age of Machiavelli. Machiavelli wrote a book called The Prince.
The what?
The Prince. And the goal of The Prince must be power, okay? And I'm going to show you a presentation here in a little bit. There's a cynical view of human nature, and fear is a better motivator than affection. In politics, he really uses deception in politics. Machiavelli. He's based in Florence during the Renaissance. He's a philosopher and a writer. I think we touched briefly before class that he was a wanted man. There were quite a few bounties on his head at one point in time. But he believed, and this is a quote, "One can make this generalization about men. They are ungrateful, fickle, liars, and deceivers. They shun danger and are greedy for profit." You guys agree with that?
What, like
If you were going to summarize mankind, would you say something like that?
I don't know.
I mean, that's pretty hard. They are ungrateful, fickle, liars, and deceivers.
I mean, some
They
people,
shun danger and are greedy for profit.
like some people, but not everybody.
That's what I'd say. Some people are not it, but he was saying that that's the way it is.
Well,
Alright, he observed city-state rulers of his day and produced guidelines for how to gain and maintain power. And that's really what The Prince is all about, how to gain and maintain power through something called absolute rule. And he felt that a ruler should be willing to do anything to maintain control without worrying about conscience. Alright, so if I don't like the way the classroom's going, is it okay for me to cut someone's head off?
no.
Exactly. That's what he said, that's what he says, it should be anything you need to do to maintain power and control. So if there's, say like there's a peaceful demonstration going on where people are protesting, Machiavelli would say, go in there and bust them up and get rid of them. They don't need them, maintain the control. Alright, today the term Machiavellian refers to the use of deceit in politics. And some of his other things are, better for a ruler to be feared than loved. Alright, not quite sure that's gonna work with American politics because you have to have a president that gets elected. Unless it's the vice president, president dies, vice president takes over, but he has to go through an election, one or the other. Rulers should be quick and decisive in decision making, if that makes sense. Ruler keeps power by any means necessary. And the end always justifies the means. He's a very power-driven person. Be good when possible, but be evil when necessary. So he says it is okay to be evil. Alright, and again, The Prince is the name of the book. And we will watch the YouTube. You can go ahead.